Greetings, baristas. It's early morning, so excuse the bags under my eyes. But anyway, the NRA, National Rifle Association, or nuts run amok ever since the 1960s, in the age of white backlash against the ghetto riots through the latest school shootings, the NRA has embroiled itself in controversy with its hard white macho line, and also for being a front for the gun lobby and major arms manufacturers like Remington, Smith & Wesson. Gun makers seem the only manufacturing interest whose product is protected by the Constitution of the United States. Like defense contractors, they profit off the insecurities of an uncertain and violent world. As American society becomes more militarized, the two positions, personal and national, fuse in a reinforcing posture of defense, and chances are if you're for one, you're for the other. Trump's wall is a perfect example of this fusion, feeding off public anxiety over alleged enemies where the foreign menace becomes the next-door threat. From this, we get the synthesis that invading other nations and peoples is just preventive home defense, not an act of aggression. The distinction becomes lost in leaps of rhetorical logic. This military-industrial tie-in has another component, overlooked by most across the spectrum except for the left and NRA members themselves in their more candid moments around the campfires and beer cans. That is, as a right-wing militia to be mobilized in support of a military coup, a backup vigilante force to aid in patrolling the streets and watching the neighborhood and the neighbors. To those who say that kind of reactionary violence can't happen here, that the rule of law in the U.S. of A. is too strong for such games, well, it hasn't yet. But remember Chile in 1970 on that other 9/11, when they freely and democratically elected their own version of Bernie Sanders according to their constitutional procedure, who was left as dead as the Chilean Constitution itself in his own White House. At Jolly Ollie North, a known defier of constitutional law and believer in special force operations, has now been elected NRA president, rather underscores the point. If Bernie were to be elected, be sure the long knives, or the long barrels, will be out for polishing. Remember also that there was talk of a military coup in the U.S. against FDR in the 1930s, half-baked and half-supported by Wall Street, with General Douglas MacArthur as the proposed caudillo. How close it was to actually happening, we'll probably never know, but at least the talk coming from the DuPont and Mellons, longtime corporate power families, was serious in nature. The NRA's opponents usually bypass these aspects because they're too controversial, preferring instead to unite public opinion around the emotional issue of mass shootings in schools and churches, a common denominator no sane person likes, and puts even the most hardcore NRA members on the defensive, a position where they do badly despite their self-defense rhetoric. The police, on their part, seem divided on the issue. Philosophically, they may agree with much of the NRA's position, yet they know the volume of illegally bought and unregistered firearms in the streets contribute greatly to gang violence and ordinary street crime. It's been a common outcry from police departments since the 80s that the gangbangers have military superiority in the streets, a deficit in firepower gladly remedied by the Pentagon dumping surplus military equipment all over the country, bringing joy and happiness, if not enhanced public safety, to the hearts of thousands of enforcement officers and millions in profits for arms contractors. And yet, there is also another side, never mentioned by NRA opponents and only in rhetorical passing by its members. Let's return to South America in the 1970s, a time of right-wing military coups and national security states and death squads that tortured human rights virtually out of existence. These were nations with strict gun control. Firearms permits were tightly regulated, expensive, and issued only to those of the safe classes, not to the average roto, campesino, or obrero. These societies never possessed a Second Amendment equivalent in their constitutions, with the universal civil right for all citizens to bear arms. If they had, would Pinochet or the Argentine colonels have come to power so easily, with such relatively little bloodshed, inflicting terror and torture on their own people with such impunity? Would the death squads of Central America have hacked their way through so much of their body politic if their peoples had possessed a legal right to push back? There would have been civil war, but the violence would not have been so one-sided. Many might have preferred to go down fighting back rather than left to hang upside down in a torture chamber, screaming out their last ounce of humanity in helpless outrage to the glee of their tormentors, reveling in an unrestricted right to inflict pain and suffering upon the powerless. But of course, that's exactly why there were no Second Amendment equivalents in these societies, to keep the lower classes in line, so that civil war could be waged in one direction only, from the top down. For that reason also, people's defense fell to the lot of armed minorities, a guerrilla vanguard, rural or urban, taking it upon their private initiative to speak for the people by shooting it out with repressive state forces, in clandestine warfare or open insurrection. If the military and police forces had had to contend with the public armed and ready, there would have been little need of such armed revolutionary vanguards. The cult of the macho warrior, gun in hand, is not a North American redneck creation, Cubaneros, as gun ownership is not in itself an indicator of social instability, as witnessed the sweeping violence of Latin America compared to the relative peace of North America. A Columbine or Sandy Hook is a terrible tragedy, but so is the targeting of older brothers and sisters, or even parents, to be hauled out of their houses by badged and uniformed men at gunpoint, to disappear forever if not unearthed 20 years later in an unmarked body dump. If the Sandy Hook kids are trying to do the same as Argentina's mothers of the plaza, demanding public accountability for violence, it still should give us pause when confronted with its manifestations. To stand a nonviolent high ground or behind a barricade. Hark! Me hears yet another mysterious phone summons. Oh. All right. Hello? Man, there's a lot of static on this line. Who? Guevara? Known as Che? How are you calling by phone without hands? Anyway, you had something to say about this issue? In 1959, when you stated the people should convert themselves into a guerrilla army whose capacity is limited only by their numbers, that all should learn how to handle weapons and when they should be used in its defense, so that the victory against a dictatorship will not be transitory? Well, what about conscientious objectors who don't want to live their lives on a war footing, who just want to live in peace and quiet without fear of 2, 3, many Sandy Hooks? You say the best guarantee of peace is to make the powerful afraid of becoming tyrants? Well, that's what laws and courts are for, right? To hold enforcement accountable to public authority and not left to individual discretion. That is, if the courts and laws and enforcement haven't been corrupted by haters of the public as now in office. And so around it goes.